Welcome to this episode of the Future of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs were adopted in 2015 by the UN member states and set a global agenda for sustainable development into 2030 and encourage global partnership to build the future and the world that we want. In the episode today, I will be focusing on goals 5 and 10, which is goal 5 is gender equality, to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls by 2030, and goal 10 is reduced inequalities, to reduce inequalities within and among nations. Each of the 17 goals has a number of targets to guide us in our efforts in terms of where we may put our focus to achieve the goals, but also to provide measures and indicators to track our progress. Some of the targets for Goal 5 in gender equality include ending all forms of discrimination, harassment, and violence against women. Other targets include valuing domestic labor and women's sexual and reproductive rights, their access to ownership, land, property, and resources, as well as access to public services, technology, and economic structures. Some of the targets under Goal 10, reduced inequalities, include reduced income inequality and accelerated income growth for the bottom 40% of the population. Targets also include facilitated migration and also establishing global financial market regulations. For the episode today, I will be discussing Goal 5, Target 5, which is equal opportunities and participation in leadership and decision-making in political, economic, and public life for women. And under Goal 10, I will be discussing Target 2, which is to empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all by 2030, which aligns well to the SDG goals of no one should be left behind. And I feel that these goals and targets align well together. Two particular trends draw my attention when I think of goals 5 and 10. The first trend for Goal 5, which is perhaps negative, is that women's underrepresentation within leadership continues, despite increasing attention and increased visibility of women representation. Unfortunately, the progress hasn't been up to scratch. There are significant gaps, specifically within leadership level, and according to the World Economic Forum Future of Job Reports 2016, at junior level, for every one woman, you would find about 2 men globally, and this number halves as you rise into the upper echelons of the organization and at CEO level. If we focus on Africa, McKinsey has commended the African private sector for being above global average in terms of women's representation at executive and board level within organizations. However, just about a third of companies, public sector companies in Africa, have no women on the board. Just about a third have only 1 woman on the board, and 20% have 2 women on the board, and a low less than 15% have more than 3 women on the board. In terms of achieving the target of equal opportunity and participation for women, this is disappointing data. More positively, if we look at Goal 10, reduced inequalities, and again with a focus on the African continent, positive trends indicate that there are expanding opportunities for the inclusion of populations towards a future of 2030 prosperity. General trends include improved political environments and government accountability, low and managed inflation rates, as well as increased market capitalization and attraction of foreign investment. Also, a growing middle class, coupled with our youth dividend, indicates that the continent is just beginning on its trajectory of growth, all criticisms and critiques notwithstanding. It is important to note, of course, that this trend is not across the continent. It will differ depending on the economies you focus on. And concurrent to these trends are also continued instability in some countries related to multiple and ongoing internal conflicts. And also we have inadequate government responses to social health epidemics, as well as crises that may arise. If we look at the business and values case in the literature for inclusivity within organizations, the case has been well made for the values of diversity in innovation, solution finding, in financial gains, augmented performance, adaptation, and creativity. And this is particularly important for organizations within a VUCA context and a VUCA world. And of course, we have equity and discrimination as a key value that we should be working towards. I recently conducted research on women in leadership within the education and business sector, looking specifically at Kenya and South Africa. And I had the opportunity to engage with researchers within the Oxford Women Leadership Symposium that had conducted similar research in different international contexts. And we were able to identify, both through my research and in consultation, a couple of factors that are obstacles to women's leadership within organizations. These include culturally restrictive environments. They also include exclusive networks. It also includes status quo within organizations and competitive cultures. If I may speak briefly to culturally restrictive environments. The McKinsey 2016 report highlights that women within organizations cite traditional attitudes and cultural attitudes to women in the workplace as a key hindrance for women in leadership and for women's participation in decision making. There was the perception that decision making was predetermined by cultural and traditional attitudes. In terms of exclusive networks, literature has shown that organizations have both a formal aspect and an informal aspect, and the informal aspect is really run by informal networks. Within an African context, where our corporate governance systems are still immature, we find that the informal structures sometimes predominate over the formal structures, making exclusive networks a specific obstacle to women in this region. In terms of the status quo, one of the reasons given for entrenched organizational cultures is related to corporate board tenure, the idea that corporate board members have been on the board for very many years, and this can encourage what is referred to as groupthink and a certain resistance to alternative approaches and alternative perspectives. And finally, competitive cultures. This is related to the generalized perception that women in leadership positions tend to take a collaborative approach. And this may sometimes rub negatively within competitive culture or within competitive cultures in organizations today. What are some of the strategies that organizations can take to address these obstacles? Mentors and role models are very important for women in leadership. Education and training in terms of upskilling women and ensuring that they have the capabilities and skills to fulfill leadership positions. Policies and programs that are progressive and supportive, including sexual harassment, but also paternity and maternity leave that values women's domestic and other gender roles. Supportive leadership that will promote the implementation and the unlearning and learning of requisite behaviors. Technology to facilitate women's different modes of work and different social and family demands. Networks to allow women leaders to collaborate with one another, develop best practice, and establish a community of peers. And finally, culture change. Culture change is particularly important and is a factor that extends from the short term to the long term, reaching down into issues of socialization within our families. Thinking about the future of the sustainable goals, 2030 is only 11 years away. Therefore, there's still a lot to be done. And the sentiment is generally that we will not be able to achieve the levels of gender equality and the reduced inequality amongst countries that we strive for within the next decade or so. However, we can definitely make the strides and ensure that the structures and institutions and systems are in place to enable a faster progression going forward. Thank you for watching this episode of The Future of the Sustainable Development Goals. Please click on the logo below to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more great content. Don't miss the next episode.